Okay, good afternoon or good morning, depending upon where you might be viewing the webcast today. I want to thank you for joining us for the introduction of our workforce study. I'm going to give you a little bit of background on what the study is all about, and really what we'd like to do today is focus in on what actions can be taken to avoid some of the uncertainties that many of us are feeling in the current state of the economic situation across the U.S. and how it impacts our business. So just by way of introductions, my name is Joel Caparella. I'm the Senior Vice President for Client Solutions here at Yo. And we conduct a survey typically annually so we could better understand our marketplace. Again, we're in the business of workforce solutions at pretty much every level, from full-time permanent recruiting to contingent and temporary staffing, payrolling, statement of work, you name it. So it's important for us to understand the landscape and to provide some recommendations on how an organization can position themselves to better address the challenges that they're facing on a daily basis. So let's go ahead and get started. First, I'm going to just give you a breakdown of what we'll be talking about. I'll give you the breakdown of the study itself. We're going to take a look at what the hiring trends based upon the results look like in 2012. This issue of how competence is impacting some of those decisions. We'll take a closer look at a lot of the anxieties and fears that leadership's faced with right about now as they look forward and ahead to the entire fiscal year of 2012. What the reality of the hiring process actually is, and I think you'll be surprised to find that really the status quo of hiring processes today ultimately amounts to delay. And then finally, we'll end up with 7 steps that you could take to eliminate the uncertainty of your workforce as you plan and strategize for achieving your objectives throughout the year. Okay, just one bit of housekeeping. If you do have questions along the way, if you could enter them in the question window, and we'll do our best to satisfy those at the end of the presentation. But let's get started. I want to focus in on how the study was conducted. We employed a firm called Amplitude Research. Amplitude Research is a research foundation that will conduct these things for companies like Yo. And here's the breakdown of the respondents. We focus on larger companies for the most part. Revenue from $750 million annually and above. So you can kind of get the breakdown in the top left part of the slide there. We did our best to target senior leadership within these organizations. So senior vice presidents were a good majority of the respondents, but you'll also see that CXOs across the board responded with a lot of frequency, as well as chief executive officers. So I think you have a very solid representation of leadership and what their perceptions are as they face the ongoing slow recovery and what they're going to do about those things. And the size of these companies were anywhere from, actually you can see it's a pretty fair breakdown from 1,500 employees all the way up to your very large organization. So we're actually very pleased with the way that broke out, because given the size of the company from a revenue perspective and the leadership that we were querying, it's what we believe is a good representation of the marketplace. Okay, let's take a look at just what leadership has said as far as what their hiring outlook is and how confident they are in their ability to handle talent demand issues. One thing that we were very encouraged by when we received the response was that a good majority of respondents felt somewhat confident. I think we call it cautiously optimistic about the prospect of 2012. And while if you look at the numbers individually, you could see that almost half say, hey, we don't expect any sweeping changes. I think combined, 35 and the 46% there really indicate that there's a cautious optimism. And I know many people have been using that phrase for quite a time, this cautious optimism about our workforce and hiring prospects. But the anticipation that there will be some level of growth, or at the very worst, not much of a decline across the year. So that's encouraging. And I think the most recent jobs report lens and the trend of the most recent 3 or 4 jobs reports has been has reinforced that. So that's certainly some good news. Next, let's take a look at really the self-reporting of how sourcing is timed within organizations. The question was, hey, when do you begin to source talent? And you could see that predominantly that a good majority of our respondents indicate that they are in what they would consider a culture of talent acquisition, that, hey, we are constantly on the lookout for the right people. You can see some of the other that hit the radar here as far as, hey, there's a workforce planning process in place. We do it when there's high turnover and attrition, or when our product or service pipeline increases notably. But predominantly, this feeling of, hey, we are in a talent acquisition culture was what we heard many times from the responses here. Now, I think you're going to see as we move forward here is that this is the beginning of the foundation of what some of the key findings of the survey are in its totality, and that is that there is a strong sense of confidence in, hey, we have the right talent acquisition culture, and you'll see in just a bit that we believe, many of leadership who responded to the survey, that they have the right processes in place. In fact, when we ask about, hey, how about your workforce today? What's your level of confidence that your workforce, as it stands today, can meet customer demand? And here's where we start to see signs of uncertainty in general, okay? Because only 26% could definitively respond that they were extremely confident or very confident in their ability to meet customer demand. A large majority, over half, said they're somewhat confident. And what this indicates to us as we kind of analyze what the results against some of the other answers is that, hey, there's some trepidation about my ability to meet demand. Not only that, but that workforces in general for the companies represented by this study have gone through a series of efficiency moves that have left them with a pretty, well, bare bones workforce. I mean, that's the only way to read into it, that I've done so much cost efficiency and cost cutting and belt tightening that I'm somewhat confident I can meet my customer demand, but I'm not very confident. And if you add the somewhat with the not at all or not very, you could see it far outweighs the very confident inability to meet demand. Now, it's a key point, okay, because we just talked about this this culture of talent acquisition that a majority of firms believe they hold, and now we're looking at, hey, we're starting to see signs here that says, hey, I'm somewhat confident about my ability to meet service and customer demand. But you'll see a little later on that this prevailing notion or sentiment over my talent acquisition culture, and you'll see in just a bit, processes seem to give me a comfort level to sit right here at this 26%. Let's shift gears and talk about what's keeping leadership up at night concerning their workforce. And there's some interesting results here. First, I think what we find is that the economy and the slow pace of recovery is absolutely top of mind. A combined 85% feel that the ongoing speed of the recovery, which has been at a snail's pace, and continued sluggish demand has perhaps the greatest impact on whether or not that workforce is going to grow in 2012. So it's the continuing looming economic uncertainty that kind of clouds our ability to feel confident enough to act, and then obviously it's tied tightly to a low product or service demand. What's interesting here is that, hey, the political debate and the talking points that you hear and the political points scored one way or the other about how uncertainty in the political realm impacts this, it absolutely, in the long run in the application impacts, and I can give you some anecdotal information about this. Smaller businesses, I think, are more in tune to how regulatory issues are going to affect them. But larger businesses typically play within a defined playing field, and even though it's not as defined as it may be in, say, a year or 18 months after the presidential election, one thing is certain is that they're less concerned about the political ramifications of what the 2012 presidential results may be, and more about just that the economy is strengthening in general. Okay, so I think the takeaway here is I think most business people don't necessarily care how these things get resolved. They hope and trust that they will, but at the end of the day, and the reality of our operational necessities is that we have to have an economy that's growing at a faster than 1.5% annually. And when those things happen, I think it's easy to extrapolate that out that we'll start to see hiring increase, obviously. However, let's take a closer look, and here's where I think you could see some of the anxieties that impact the inability to make decisions here, right? Because 83% of the respondents, when we ask them specifically, what are the uncertainties that you're concerned about today, an overwhelming 83% highlighted areas that are completely beyond their control. The economy, for instance, state, local, federal regulatory issues, and then lastly, the industry trends. So these three things are top of mind as far as, hey, these uncertainties impact my decision making, impact my ability to construct a workforce that I need, and keep me up. They are things that I am uncertain, fearful of, okay? However, when you take a look at the issues that are within their control, only 17% that say that they're concerned or there's uncertainty over their operational factors, things that they have direct impact on. Now, this is a little tea leaf reading, okay, but what this indicates to us, again, especially in our travels, and as we talk to a lot of our clients, is that the 17% makes sense because there's an overwhelming confidence in my ability, given all the cost efficiency that I've gone through in the past 4 years, that my workforce and how I'm executing and operating gives me a high level of ability to react, to respond, to adjust. Okay, so the anxiety, I think you'll see in a little bit that the anxiety could potentially be misplaced because it is within the 17% that we can act, that we can enable, and that we can structure so that we can be prepared regardless of what the economic trend or the industry trends or the regulatory climate may or may not be. So here I think reinforces that very fact. When we asked about, hey, let's say tomorrow the economy all of a sudden is as strong as it was before the recession began, okay, before that massive crash in 2008. How are you going to handle that? How are you going to handle that product and service demand? This was startling to us because we did not think we were going to get this kind of reaction, okay? More than half of the respondents truly believe that they could respond 5 months, 6 months or less to a dramatic increase in service or product demand. So if economic recovery was overnight completed, most firms think it's just a mere matter of months until they'll be able to respond. So this is that notion. Now let's go back to the previous slide here for a second. We talked about a lot of fear and in the areas I can't control and a confidence in the areas that I can. And then a prevailing sentiment that my organization is poised to be able to respond and react quickly. All right, now we're going to take a look at some of the operational realities in a moment, but here's where, you know, if you came to look for some information about how to extrapolate it out to your organization, this is where you could begin to start to look for some clues. Is that confidence, is it valid, or is it maybe wishful thinking? Let's keep going on here. And I think what we found here is that we think it could be a little bit more wishful thinking because the reality of many hiring processes and workforce planning processes today ultimately results in delay. So let's take a look at that. First, we asked, hey, what are the greatest challenges in your workforce planning? And 56% told us that finding and hiring the right person for the job is the greatest challenge that they seek. That they are faced with on a daily basis, okay? They feel that talent needs analysis is something they're doing at a fairly decent level. Scenario planning is happening, and their onboarding and their process for training is set. Okay, so now let's compare this with that sentiment about, hey, we are in a talent acquisition culture. Well, how can this be if more than half the respondents believe that their culture is talent acquisition oriented, yet finding the right person is the greatest challenge? You could see where the sentiment over my organization may start to be mismatched with the realities of how I'm operating and managing my workforce. Looking a little further, we dove into the details of the actual workforce planning process that's in place. Now, look, here's where the rubber begins to meet the road. 79% said there is absolutely no workforce planning process in place, or we do it on demand, or it's static. We don't change it a whole lot. Only 21% reported that they have a dynamic, malleable, changing, adaptable workforce planning process. So now, hopefully, you can kind of see the thread here. Believe we're in a talent acquisition culture, yet finding the right person is our greatest challenge. Believe that our onboarding and things like that are in place in our scenario planning, yet 79% have no dynamic process. Okay, so the reality of how we're running our staff and our workforce planning begin to kind of set in here, and like I said earlier, and you'll see in this next slide, the result is inevitably delay, because when you take a look at these numbers, how long does it take you to establish that an employee is competent, okay, that there's competency in your new hire? And then the next step, how long until you get that employee highly productive? If you combine those two numbers, okay, those two questions, you're looking about at least a year on average that most respondents said by their own self-reporting of their experience until they get a new employee highly productive. Okay, so now let's go back to the question about if economic recovery turned around tomorrow. Many believe that they'd be ready to handle that demand and services 6 months or less. However, the reality here is if we operate on our average expectations, we're looking about a year until that new segment of our workforce can be placed in a position where they can be considered highly productive. All right, so there's absolutely a misalignment here with what the competence is in my ability to react to change and the reality. And then it gets compounded if we look at the frequency of reconciliation of our workforce plan. Okay, 79% of the respondents said they're only reconciling that workforce plan 4 times a year. Okay, and that's actually 45% said 4 times a year. Some of them are doing it even less. Okay, so some of them on an annual basis, and 16% not even doing it at all. So a collective 79% at best are reconciling that workforce plan 4 times a year or less. Now, look, in the past, say 3 years, for many organizations, there hasn't been an extreme volume of hiring. So in many industries anyway, so maybe that 4 times a year or less worked, okay? But what we're looking at here is a situation where processes have been streamlined and thin. My confidence is a little overrated on how I can react, yet I'm not reconciling my workforce plan consistently enough to be able to even identify where change needs to occur, needs to happen. So what are the key findings? What are the takeaways from the survey? I think there's 2. One is it's clear that uncertainty absolutely freezes hiring decisions. I mean, there's no doubt about it that if I have continued trepidation over the demand for products and services, how quickly the GDP is or is not growing, what the unemployment numbers at a national level look like, it precludes me from making investments that I might regret 3 months later. Once I get someone on staff, it's an incredibly expensive proposition to downsize, okay? And that's well documented. In addition to that, the survey clearly indicates that there's an overconfidence in the ability to react quickly, okay? That the frozen decisions over hiring are compounded by the belief, the mistaken belief, that I can react immediately when I need to as demand begins to increase. Now, how do we eliminate some of these uncertainties? And that's the key here. We want to eliminate all the uncertainties over our workforce, and we believe that there's 7 steps that you could implement to do that. So let's walk through them one at a time, and then at the end, if there's any time, we'll take some questions. So the first thing is to audit the competency and productivity duration. And what I mean by that is the estimate of, hey, it takes us 6 months to get somebody to evaluate their competency. It takes another 6 months to get them to highly productive. That's what we're talking about. We have to move talent from evaluation to productivity as quickly as possible. So a couple things have to happen here. One is we need to master what that actual time is. And what we mean by this is don't just look at the numbers on the spreadsheet that you have as far as the time to hire or what the placement ratios may be, but dive into that to speak with the hiring managers and the leadership that are responsible for moving, whether it's a single person of talent or an entire team, into a position. What are the anecdotal evidence of the impact that it had upon the objective at hand? You have to master what that actual time is, anecdotally speaking. So you want some stories, in other words, to see across different areas what that timing meant, what the downfall or the pitfalls were against that timeline, and then what can be done to improve it. There also needs to be an acknowledgement that the skill sets, as they increase, okay, the complexity increases as well. Now, it could be kind of common sense to say that, but many times it's not a finite skill set on one particular area. There's a combination of skill sets that need to come together to complete a task or a job or a project, okay, to address that client demand or product demand. So there needs to be acknowledgement that skill set complexity must be considered in this timeline evaluation. Obviously, we want to align the projected product or service demand to talent needs. And this goes back to the workforce planning we talked about and the timeliness of it, okay? Projections are made, sales projections, growth projections, and not always are they reconciled with the skill sets or the talent that needs to be on hand here. And look, this leads into the next bullet. What we can't do is we can't assume that our talent roster is completely classified. And what I mean by that is that, look, there's job descriptions, that's one thing, okay, when you're looking to fill a role. Okay, but there's a more nuanced approach to what are the talent types that need to be embedded, that need to be productive, that need to be competent in order to meet stated objectives and stated growth. What we see successful firms doing, and what we sometimes help clients with, is classify those areas of talent so that there's a roster of not open jobs, but a roster of open talent and positions, and it's categorized in a way so I know what the big categories are. So then I can move, therefore, these categories into the areas of the business that I can, and I know then how to source and how to place and how to onboard, train, and expedite their competency evaluation and their productivity. And then lastly, estimated the projected talent use. So, it kind of goes with aligning what the growth is going to be, what's the estimated use against the plan. What's the second step? Second step is that there needs to be an acknowledgement over the talent deficit as well. Now, we've written quite a bit about this, and I'll give you our blog address at the end here, but we've written a lot about the talent deficit. Look, the reality is that you have to understand the math, okay, of your talent deficit. Even if your hiring is not at a high rate currently, what we need to appreciate is that if I have a certain number of positions open, unless I have 100% placement ratio over that, and then I add more positions the following month, is that deficit begins to build. Okay, so look, I think I haven't really met the firm once that can fill at 100%. Okay, it's not an easy task to get the right person in the right job. We saw that earlier as our respondent stated here. But what is possible is to manage that deficit, and to manage it, you need to understand what it means to your organization. So what does that lead us to? It leads us to understanding that if we accept the status quo as stated in our survey results here, that if the turnaround does pick up speed, that there is potential for massive talent deficit, especially when you consider that there'll be a lot more movement of talent because there's less fear over having a job if the job market's a little bit better. Okay, so what can you do here? You can discreetly mark those major skill areas that have the highest deficit probability. Okay, so if we understand what the math is on a daily, on an operational basis, we understand the skills that have that high probability, we can begin to take action here. Okay, we take action by prioritizing the focus against those skill areas and then adjusting our processes accordingly. What this does is it helps us to identify where the passive talent deficit exists today. So what I mean by that is general attrition that may be going on in the organization may start to beget larger deficits. So we have to identify those. And most importantly, and I think this is the strongest takeaway here regarding the talent deficit, is that we have to build community. And what I mean by that is not internally, but the external community, the skills community, the talent community, if you will, of our interaction with individuals that have the skill sets that meet that skill set roster that we spoke of in the previous slide. Okay, so we have to evaluate the talent deficit. We need to be mindful of it and prepare to address it if and when it grows. Okay, regulatory and contingency planning. Look, death and taxes, they say, are the only certainty, and that's not necessarily a bad thing because we know we can be certain of them, right? And even though there's fear around maybe where the regulatory changes may be, there's some actions that can be taken today that allow us to estimate what we need to have in place to address them. So look, local, state, and federal tax compliance issues have to be evaluated for their potential impact. So, but yet the second bullet here says a pragmatic evaluation. It doesn't need to be sky is falling approach, but it does need to be, hey, what's the pragmatic likelihood? I mean, the truth of the matter is broad sweeping changes in the tax code don't happen too frequently, even though the healthcare reform is impacting businesses even as we speak. So that's obviously an exception. But therefore, if we take a look at what's the potential impact, an if-then type of analysis, it helps us to prioritize. And then this projected impact on the workforce composition has to be evaluated as well, because the use of certain forms of talent, like temporary laborers, like contracted laborers, consultants, things like that, may need to be adjusted against the projected impact of the regulatory requirements. And then finally, increase the visibility and responsibility. Hiring managers need to be made aware of the pitfalls of their use of certain types of talent. It's as simple as that. If it's not their responsibility, then it typically has a higher probability of falling through the cracks. So exercise an audit of your ability to respond to current and potential changes in regulatory and tax code. Finally, the workforce plan, it needs to be measured. Okay, we have to make sure that we're reconciling, and quarterly simply is not enough. So how do we increase the frequency of this? Well, the first thing is evaluating how current staffing levels are responding to our current operations. In other words, what are the other metrics, like customer satisfaction metrics, like product fulfillment if we're in a retail setting, or even manufacturing delivery, things like that. Any metric that's operational in nature that dictates the health of your business should be extrapolated out to evaluate how your staffing levels are set and what their part is in those resulting numbers. And then what we're able to do is actively monitor demand in those areas where we evaluated that workforce has a direct impact of these metrics. So if you know where to look for changes in demand that your workforce inherently has a hand in, you'll know where and when to make the changes. And what we believe is, and we always encourage our clients, is that, hey, at least a monthly reconciliation against the plan should be conducted. Some months it might not be as aggressive as others, but if a monthly plan is in place, then I am positioned well to course correct almost immediately. Okay, so now what we're doing here with this recommendation is we're pulling in that sentiment of confidence and making it an operational reality. So instead of a delay, we are increasing our ability to improve our position to react and capitalize on new demand. Because think about it, if I am a year away from being able to handle a massive increase in product or service demand, I have to consider my competitors and what they're doing, right? And you want to be faster than a year. You need to capitalize on that opportunity, because frequently in economic recovery, the biggest opportunity, the highest margins exist early on in the recovery. So if you're late to the game, you're going to miss all that upside potential. Let's take a look at scenario planning, and this is something that we don't see many doing, and an area that is an easy win if you employ it even a little bit. And really what this is the realistic navigation of where your organization is headed. Okay, so all paths need to be evaluated. Now look, it can't be a complete what if anything, kitchen sink approach, but it does have to be a pragmatic evaluation of all possible events that can occur that impact your business. So for instance, you hear people talk about how the tsunami last year impacted the supply chain in Japan to deliver auto parts, electronics, and things like that. It had severe impact. Now, I don't know that there was a tsunami contingency plan in place, but there certainly can be some level of disaster recovery. We do it for our data, so therefore we should do it for our workforce as well. Now, it doesn't have to be, again, the unlikelihood of a natural disaster could be obviously prioritized a little lower, but the point is have something in place so that if certain things were to happen, we're easily positioned to respond. And that's what the navigation really means there in that second bullet, is that, hey, I have to have a clear way to navigate all these contingencies. And then, again, this goes back to the timeliness of reconciliation, is that I have to reconcile against this contingency planning. So in other words, on that monthly revisiting of my workforce plan, I have to be, again, pragmatic in how I am reconciling the workforce plan, not just against the product or service demand, but also against where am I in my scenario planning, okay? And this also allows us to focus on the most highly probable events, and then most importantly, it defines the use of all applicable talent supply options. Now, this is a little, we feel kind of passionate about this because we are a talent supply provider, obviously. So, but you want to evaluate your supply chain. How well set up is my supply chain to deliver talent, to help me ebb and flow talent, to accelerate talent in certain areas if certain scenarios come into play. So this is an exercise in taking a close look at your talent supply channels and evaluate their strengths, their weaknesses, and exploit them for their strengths and mitigate their weaknesses. The composition needs to be taken a good hard look at as well, and really you want to understand what the foundation of your current workforce composition is, and it's really a comprehensive analysis of all members of the extended workforce. So when a company like Yo talks about that, what that means is not just your W-2 employees, but your temporary employees, your consultants that are on site, your independent contractors, anyone that has, by the nature of what they do for a living and how you're paying them, impacts your objectives. So really it's an evaluation to here also to exploit where those efficiencies exist. Okay, so what this exercise does, if I'm very efficient at using temporary professionals, for instance, to quickly ramp up a new area or to extend the life of an existing product or something of that nature, I want to do more of that. Or on the other side of that coin, eliminate inefficiencies if, let's say, I'm paying too many staffing providers and therefore I'm not gaining economies of scale over that. We recommend doing this on a quarterly basis, okay, to evaluate, again, the supply chain itself and how it's performing. And then it needs to be an ongoing, continuous monitoring of where these members of the talent pool are placed, how they're being managed, and what the cost structure is. So we talk about this as a cost of value. Okay, you want to evaluate not just the pure dollars and cents and the expense, the labor expense, but hey, what is the expense that I am required to pay to get the appropriate level of value? And what this does is it lets me focus on the value rather than the expense. So if I say, hey, I'm willing to pay X for a value of Y, it lets me have a much stronger position aligning my workforce with the operational plan of my organization. Okay, let's take a look at the seventh step here. And what is that seventh step? It's really the recruiting infrastructure itself. Okay, look, I don't think it's a secret that one of the first skill sets to go when recession hits is those that are looking to fill new talent positions, right? Recruiters. The recession hit the core recruiting competencies very hard. What many firms are failing to do right now is identifying those underdeveloped areas of their permanent recruiting infrastructure. Okay, and again, we believe, although we don't have, again, as many facts here to reinforce it, but just anecdotally in our dealings with our clients, we believe that this sense of confidence they have over the ability to ramp up quickly lies in the belief of the recruiting infrastructure is as healthy as it was in the latter part of 2006, 2007. That's just not the case. So those underdeveloped areas have to be identified, and we need to avoid that wishful thinking that I can respond quickly. And this goes back to our very first step as well. What's the math of the capacity you could handle? Okay, look, it's simple. Everyone knows about how long it takes to hire certain skill sets in certain positions. So we need to reverse engineer that. And if my workforce plan says I need 10 of this particular skill set, it takes me this amount of time to fill them, you know immediately what your capacity is. If you know what your capacity is, then you know whether your infrastructure is set up to handle that capacity or it's not. So with this information in mind, we need to bolster the inefficiencies, our infrastructure deficiencies is what we need to do. So we need to identify the areas where we need to make some investments. Now look, this all goes back to the uncertainty idea in general. These are the areas we can control. Okay, we can't control tax and regulatory, we can't control industry trends necessarily, we can't control economic factors just in the macro level. Okay, well, we can control our ability to respond. So we have to at the very least, I'm not saying like increase your spending on recruiting, but at least have a plan in place, whether you do it internally, whether you employ someone like a Yo to help you, with your recruitment in an outsourcing fashion, but put something in place that says if X happens and I'm going to need to increase my talent demand or my talent, and I'm going to put this in place to handle that demand. Okay, so there's the 7 steps just as a takeaway. Again, you want to audit your competency, your productivity duration, evaluate the talent deficit, look at your regulatory contingency planning. You want to increase your workforce planning reconciliation, conduct some standard workforce scenario planning, take a hard look at your workforce composition and how it exists and the cost of value of that workforce, and then finally evaluate your recruiting infrastructure for its ability to react to changes in demand. So look, that's the meat of what we're going to talk about. I'll take some questions. We have a few questions here that I'll get to in a minute. But a couple things I want to share with you. The study was conducted at the beginning part of this year. This URL down at the bottom of the screen is a free access to our study. All you need to do is just fill out the form here. You'll get a download of the detailed study that you could share with your peers and maybe leadership at your organization. There's also a free infographic there that you could take a look, and that's actually not a bad thing. We've actually seen some of our clients printing the infographic and putting it up in their offices just as a reminder of the things they need to react to and where to focus their efforts so that it's not on things they can't control. So I would encourage you to take a look at that, pass that link around. In addition, we do quite a bit of writing about these things. You could look at our blog posts. We did a couple blog posts on the survey. and you can go to the seamlessworkforce.com. So if you go to Seamless Workforce, you can search in the survey, and you'll get some good information there. The infographics down there as well. And look, just in general, we'd like to encourage you here is this is a conversation. We get our ability to analyze these things and to deliver services against them if we're having an active conversation with those that these matters mean something to. So we encourage you to not just visit the blog, but take part and enjoy and engage yourself in the conversation. And then lastly, I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you a little bit about us. So Yo is provider of workforce solutions. One area that we focus in is staffing solutions. So professional degreed, certified professionals that you need on a temporary basis. Look, and we feel pretty confident that we are one of the forward thinkers in how a staffing solution should and will impact the business if executed properly. So I would encourage you to go to hiring.yo.com/staffing solutions, and there's plenty of information, streamline some access to some of the things we've written. There's 3 or 4 ebooks up there, some presentations. So by all means, if you're interested in about the talent deficit, how to handle it, if you want to understand some of the game-changing trends in the workforce in 2012, we would encourage you to visit that as well. Okay, so I hopefully I didn't go too quick here. I do have a couple questions, so I'm going to go ahead and get started on them. And okay, so here we go. First question, regarding workforce composition, it says, by the way, if you want to answer put questions in, go ahead and put them in the little question box there. So the first question comes in, says, regarding workforce composition, what role should leadership play in its evaluation? Look, it's a good question. It's one we get asked a lot. And here's what I say. What happens, and again, in our line of work, we see this quite a bit. And one of the things that we see is that labor-related expenses only apply sometimes in the accounting process anyway to those that are on staff. Okay, so a budget that's used for contingent workers, for consultants, for independent contractors isn't necessarily categorized as labor-related expense. What everyone in the organization, now look, it's a balancing act. Okay, it's a balancing act because you don't want to handcuff a hiring manager's ability to do what they need to do, and it ultimately is their budget. What you do want to do is inject a culture, however, that if somebody of talent is in our organization impacting what we do, then we need to be mindful of where they are, what their impact is, not as a thou shalt not budget outside of X kind of way, but more in, hey, what's the manner in which we can better use these types of resources. So leadership at all levels needs to be indoctrinated and bought into that type of approach. I have another question here. What metrics should be utilized in assessing the performance of the workforce plan? I mentioned it earlier, but one thing that we would recommend is obviously the standard metrics, time to hire and things like that, and the onboarding speed and productivity assessment all needs to happen. That's a given. However, what we would encourage is that you look for, like I mentioned earlier, the areas of your operation that you measure on a daily basis that tell you a little bit about your operational ability, and you're going to find clues in there to help you reconcile your workforce plan. Okay, so that's what we would encourage there. Okay, another question: what arguments should be made to build the recruiting infrastructure ahead of anticipated demand? And look, we think that's a great question. I'm going to stack the deck a little bit. We would encourage you to seek out, whether it's a Yo or someone else, we would encourage you to seek out partners here that can at least recommend. And look, like what we do, we would love to have your business, obviously, right? But we're also passionate about our ability to deliver on these topics. So, we're more than happy to share information and insight without whether or not there's some sort of engagement. So that's one thing I would suggest is, hey, go get the information from external sources, whether it's a Yo or someone else, to start to show where the impact to quickly ramping up staff matters and where the bottlenecks are and things like that. Internally, what I would suggest is I think the argument can be made that against the capacity, right? Do the math, like I said earlier. If you know what your capacity is, then it's an easy case to say, hey, look, I know you want sales to increase by X% in second quarter, but we only have this many sales guys, and even at 100% quota, we know not everyone's going to be at 100% quota. This is what the result's going to be. Therefore, we need to make some investments in the recruiting infrastructure. Okay, another question is, how well defined should my workforce scenarios be? That's a good question as well. I think what they need to be is they need to be not, I don't want to say anecdotal, but they need to have a clear what if. Okay, so in other words, the scenario needs to be representation of what the scenario is. Okay, major supplier increases their price by 35%, or oil prices go up by X, or competitor drops out, so now we have all their business. Those are the types of things. They need to be defined. They need to be tangible. They can't be lofty kind of generalizations. They have to be specific. That's what we recommend. Here, I have a question here. Do you find companies with split ownership of labor, example, HR for full-time employees, procurement for contingent labor, impedes? Oops, I lost it. Impedes the. I'm sorry, guys. Give me a second here. My apologies. Well, okay, impedes the ability to have a comprehensive workforce. Look, I'm actually surprised it wasn't a question that we planted, right, because that's a great question. It's got to be collaborative, right? Again, just because I know I stumbled on that question, it's do you find that companies with a split ownership of labor, for example, HR for full-time employees, procurement for contingent labor, impedes the ability to have a comprehensive workforce? And I think it absolutely does. I think that look, procurement's involved for a very good reason. It's their job to gain that cost of value. Okay, HR has things that they're good at. It needs to be a collaborative effort between hiring manager, HR, and procurement. I mean, those three need to be talking, especially in the areas where it's non-traditional labor. Okay, where it's contingent, where it's a statement of work, things like that. If those relationships are not strong, then the ability to have a truly well-vetted and well-researched and understood workforce plan is challenging. So that's what I'd recommend there. Okay, let's see if there's anything else here. Okay, I think that's actually the last question. So listen, I want to mention that the link to the asset that I spoke of earlier will be sent out to you. So I encourage you to download it. If you have questions, I'd ask you to take some time to reach out to us and let us know what we can help you with. And by all means, please hit our blog, engage in the conversation, help highlight areas that we haven't even considered yet, and hopefully you've learned a thing or two here and you'll be able to apply them. So I want to thank you very much for your time and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.